As twilight descended over Chicago, the air crackled with the electricity of an impending confrontation. In the shadowy corner of a bustling supermarket parking lot, a scene of cruelty unfolded that would change several lives forever. A burly man with cold eyes delivered a vicious kick to a scruffy dog belonging to an elderly homeless man who sat quietly against a concrete barrier, his weathered face lined with years of hardship. Flourishing tails, the dog's yelp pierced through the ambient noise of car doors and shopping carts, a sound so full of pain it seemed to hang in the air. Yet the aggressor merely smirked, satisfaction evident in his stance as he towered over his victims. What he failed to notice were the steady eyes watching from just 20 feet away, the unwavering gaze of Michael. What had begun as an ordinary evening, with people rushing through their errands before heading home, was about to transform into something extraordinary. In that moment, as darkness and light collided in the asphalt expanse, justice was poised to emerge from an unexpected champion. For when the right person stands at the crossroads of cruelty and compassion, remarkable things can happen. What do you think will unfold next in this confrontation? Will the aggressive stranger face consequences for his cruelty? How will this encounter change the homeless man's life? Share your thoughts in the comments below and make sure to stay connected for our next story that explores another powerful moment of human connection. The supermarket parking lot buzzed with activity as evening shoppers hurried through their routines. Beneath fluorescent lights that cast harsh shadows, the world moved in its predictable rhythm. Cars pulling in and out, shopping carts rattling across asphalt, people moving with determined strides, their minds already home, while their bodies completed the day's final tasks. In a forgotten corner where the light barely reached and few bothered to look, sat James. His dark skin had weathered countless seasons, etched with lines that told stories of hardship few could imagine. His thin frame was draped in layers of mismatched clothing, a faded blue jacket several sizes too large, threadbare jeans patched multiple times, and boots held together more by hope than material. Despite the weight of his circumstances, James carried himself with quiet dignity, his shoulders straight even as they bore invisible burdens. Nestled against him was Buddy, a small terrier mix with patches of caramel and white fur. The dog's ribs pressed visibly against his skin, his coat dull from malnutrition, yet his eyes remarkably bright. Those eyes, alert, intelligent, and fiercely loyal, followed every movement in their vicinity with cautious attention. Buddy's ears twitched at each passing sound, his body instinctively positioned between James and the world that had shown them both so little kindness. James's calloused fingers moved gently through Buddy's fur, the repetitive motion as comforting to him as it was to the dog. They had been together for 3 years of sleeping under bridges, of sharing meager meals, of huddling together through winter storms and summer heat. 3 years of being each other's only constant in a world of shifting shadows and closed doors. "We'll be all right tonight," James whispered, his voice rough from disuse. Buddy responded with a soft whine, pressing closer as if understanding the uncertainty behind those words. A cardboard sign rested against James's knee, its edges softened by wear. The words, "Any help appreciated, God bless," written in careful block letters. Most people walked past without a glance, their eyes sliding over him as if he were part of the landscape. Not quite human, not quite visible. James had grown accustomed to this particular kind of invisibility, this erasure from the world of the scene. Yet in this moment of quiet connection between man and dog, there existed a peace that many rushing by would never know, the profound understanding between two souls who had nothing but each other, and somehow found that it was enough. The peaceful moment between James and Buddy shattered as the parking lot's ambient noise was suddenly overwhelmed by the aggressive roar of an approaching motorcycle. The engine's growl reverberated off the concrete barriers, deliberately over-revved, demanding attention like a predator's warning call. Heads turned throughout the lot as the black machine cut through the evening air, weaving between parked cars with calculated recklessness. "Easy, boy," he whispered, though his own heart had quickened its pace. The rider dismounted with deliberate slowness, movements exaggerated as if performing for an audience, He pulled off his helmet to reveal a face that seemed crafted for intimidation. Sharp features set in a permanent sneer, closely cropped hair, and eyes that held the cold calculation of someone who measured his worth by the fear he could inspire in others. The motorcycle skidded to a dramatic stop about 30 feet from where James sat, tires screeching against asphalt in a display of unnecessary dominance. Buddy tensed immediately, his small body going rigid against James's side, a low rumble forming in his throat. James placed a protective hand on the dog's back, feeling the tremor of anxiety running through his companion. Several shoppers instinctively altered their paths, giving him a wide berth without making it obvious they were doing so. The mother pulled her curious child closer, hurrying toward their car. An elderly man paused in loading his groceries, watching warily before continuing his task with greater urgency. The invisible bubble of caution that formed around Scott was precisely what he craved. This wordless acknowledgement of his power to disrupt. Scott, though no one in the parking lot knew his name, stood at 6'2", his frame imposing in a worn leather jacket, adorned with patches suggesting affiliations with groups known for their volatility. Tribal tattoos snaked up his neck, disappearing beneath his jawline, while others decorated his knuckles, spelling out fear and pain in faded blue ink. He surveyed his surroundings with the casual arrogance of someone who believed the world existed for his amusement. His gaze drifted across the parking lot until it landed on James and Buddy. Something shifted in his expression, a darkening, a focusing of attention that sent warning signals through anyone observing. His mouth curved into what resembled a smile but contained no warmth, only the anticipation of entertainment at someone else's expense. Scott began moving toward them with unhurried confidence, each step deliberate and heavy. The sound of his boots striking the pavement created a rhythm that seemed to count down to confrontation. As he approached, a few bystanders slowed their pace, sensing the building tension but unsure whether to intervene or hurry away. James felt the change in the air, the shift from anonymity to unwanted visibility. After years on the street, he had developed an acute sensitivity to danger, and every instinct now told him that trouble was walking directly toward him, wearing boots and a predatory smile. Scott stopped directly in front of James, casting a long shadow that seemed to deliberately blot out what little warmth remained in the evening light. He stood with legs planted wide, hands resting on his belt buckle in a posture of casual dominance. The smell of leather and cigarettes hung around him like an aura. James kept his eyes lowered, a survival tactic learned through countless similar encounters. Experience had taught him that eye contact could be interpreted as challenge, and challenges rarely ended well for men in his position. Buddy, however, stared directly at Scott, his small body trembling but alert, sensing the threat in the man's stance. "Well, what do we have here?" Scott drawled, his voice pitched deliberately loud enough for nearby shoppers to hear. "The local wildlife and his pet." "We're not bothering anyone, sir," James said quietly, his voice carrying the weary dignity of someone who had spoken these exact words too many times before. Scott chuckled, a sound entirely devoid of humor. "Sir, listen to that. At least someone taught you manners before you ended up in the gutter." He glanced around, noting the uncomfortable expressions of shoppers who slowed to witness the interaction, but quickly averted their eyes when caught looking. This public discomfort only seemed to fuel his performance. "What's with the mutt?" Scott nudged James's cardboard sign with the toe of his boot, deliberately knocking it over. "Looks like it's one meal away from being a skeleton. You think that's fair? Keeping an animal when you can't even feed yourself?" A middle-aged woman pushing a shopping cart paused several yards away, her expression troubled. For a moment it seemed she might approach, but then she continued on. Her pace quickened, eyes cast downward. An elderly man shook his head disapprovingly but remained silent as he loaded groceries into his trunk. Two teenage boys stood watching openly, one filming with his phone, the other whispering something that made them both snicker. "He's my friend," James answered simply, gathering his sign and setting it upright again. "We take care of each other." Buddy shifted closer to James, a low growl rumbling in his chest. The sound was barely audible, more vibration than noise, but Scott caught it. His eyes narrowed.
"Oh, tough guy, huh?"
He crouched down, bringing his face uncomfortably close to the dog. You got something to say to me, Fleabag? The movement was so sudden that several onlookers gasped. Scott's boot shot forward, connecting with Buddy's ribs with a sickening thud. The dog yelped sharply, his small body tumbling several feet across the rough pavement. James tensed, his hand moving protectively toward Buddy. Please, he doesn't mean... No, James cried out, lunging forward to gather his whimpering companion. His hands trembled as they gently cradled Buddy, checking for injuries. Why would you do that? He never hurt anyone. Scott straightened, laughing as if he just delivered the punchline to a joke, teaching it some manners. Dogs should know their place. He glanced around at the shocked faces of bystanders, seeming to relish their horror, just like people should. A tense silence fell over the immediate area. A woman covered her mouth in shock. A man in a business suit took half a step forward before hesitating, conflict evident on his face. No one spoke. No one intervened. No one except the broad-shouldered figure who had been watching from beside a blue pickup truck, who now moved with quiet purpose toward the unfolding scene. The words cut through the parking lot's tense atmosphere with the precision of a blade, not shouted, not even particularly loud, but delivered with such quiet authority that they seemed to physically halt the moment. Heads turned toward the source. That's enough. Robert stood approximately 15 feet away, his presence commanding immediate attention without any theatrical display. At 6'4", his frame filled out a simple gray Henley that stretched across broad shoulders, paired with dark jeans and well-worn work boots. His closely cropped dark hair and the shadow of stubble along his jaw gave him a rugged appearance, but it was his eyes that truly captured attention, steady, focused, and utterly unintimidated. Scott turned slowly, his body language shifting subtly from predatory confidence to wary assessment. He straightened to his full height, squaring his shoulders in an unconscious attempt to match Robert's imposing stature. The parking lot fell into a strange hush. A shopping cart that had been rattling nearby suddenly seemed too loud in the silence. Someone's car engine idling took on the quality of distant thunder. Mind your own business, Scott said, but the edge in his voice had dulled slightly, uncertainty creeping in where arrogance had reigned moments before. A young mother hurriedly ushered her curious child into their car, closing the door firmly before continuing to watch from what she deemed a safe distance. An elderly couple paused their grocery loading, the husband whispering something to his wife while keeping his eyes fixed on the confrontation. A store employee hovering near the entrance pulled out a phone, thumb poised over the screen, ready to call for help if needed. Robert remained perfectly still, his gaze unwavering. He didn't clench his fists or adopt a fighting stance. He simply stood, a human barrier between cruelty and its intended targets. The lack of visible aggression somehow made his presence more intimidating, a calm certainty that required no posturing. I said that's enough, Robert repeated, his voice carrying the same measured tone. He took a single step forward, the movement deliberate and unhurried. Scott's hand twitched at his side, his fingers curling slightly. The calculation was visible on his face, weighing options, measuring the man before him, assessing risks. His eyes darted briefly to the growing audience, noting the phones now recording the encounter, then back to Robert's impassive expression. Robert's response was simple. I know exactly who I'm dealing with. The quiet certainty in those words carried more weight than any shouted challenge could have. You have no idea who you're dealing with, Scott warned, but the threat sounded hollow even to his own ears. Scott's expression hardened as he fully turned to face Robert, deliberately placing his back to James and Buddy as if to emphasize how insignificant he considered them. The artificial lighting of the parking lot cast harsh shadows across his face, deepening the lines of contempt etched around his mouth. The air between Robert and Scott seemed to crackle with tension, a silent battle of wills playing out in the mundane setting of a supermarket parking lot as evening deepened around them. In that suspended moment, with witnesses gathering at a safe distance, and the injured dog trembling in its owner's arms, something fundamental hung in the balance, not just the outcome of this confrontation, but a test of what people would allow to happen in their presence. James remained on the ground, cradling Buddy protectively against his chest, the dog's whimpers having subsided to shallow, rapid breathing. His weathered face registered shock and disbelief as he watched someone, a complete stranger, stand up for him after countless others had turned away. "It doesn't matter who I am," Robert replied, his voice level. "What matters is what you just did." He gestured slightly toward James and Buddy, without taking his eyes off Scott. "And what you're not going to do anymore." Robert remained motionless, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to Scott's agitated posturing. The distance between them, approximately 10 feet of cracked asphalt, seemed charged with potential energy. More shoppers had paused their evening routines, forming a loose semicircle of witnesses. The soft electronic beeps of phones being activated to record the confrontation punctuated the tense silence. "And who exactly are you supposed to be?" Scott demanded, injecting false bravado into his voice. "The homeless patrol? The Mutt Protection Agency?" He forced a laugh that didn't reach his eyes. A teenage girl whispered something to her friend, both watching wide-eyed from beside a parked sedan. A middle-aged man in a business suit had set his groceries down on the hood of his car, his hand hovering near his phone as if debating whether to call authorities. The store manager had emerged from the automatic doors, standing uncertainly at the perimeter of the gathering crowd. Robert's expression remained unchanged, but something shifted in his stance, an almost imperceptible adjustment of weight, a slight lowering of his center of gravity. Nothing overt, nothing aggressive, but to anyone trained to read body language, it was a clear message. He was prepared. Scott's smirk faltered momentarily before he forced it back into place. "Oh, I get it. You're one of those guys who thinks he's some kind of hero." He took a half step forward, his fingers flexing at his sides. "Let me tell you something, friend. This isn't your business, and that," he jerked his thumb toward James, "isn't worth your trouble." "You made it my business," Robert said. His gaze flicked briefly to James and Buddy, noting the way the older man was gently examining the dog's side where Scott's boot had connected. When his eyes returned to Scott, there was a new intensity in them. "You have two choices right now: walk away, or show everyone here exactly what kind of person you are." Scott's jaw tightened, a muscle twitching visibly along his temple. The calculation was evident in his expression, weighing his pride against the growing realization that he had miscalculated. What had begun as easy intimidation of someone who couldn't fight back had evolved into something far more public, far more consequential. "You threatening me?" Scott demanded, his voice rising slightly. A few onlookers shifted uncomfortably, sensing the escalation. Robert shook his head once, the movement minimal. Not a threat, a reality check. He remained perfectly still, his voice dropping slightly so that Scott had to focus to hear him. "Ask yourself if whatever you're planning is worth what comes after." The implicit warning hung in the air between them. Scott's gaze darted around, suddenly aware of just how many witnesses surrounded them, how many phones were capturing every word, every expression. His next move would be preserved, shared, judged, not just by those present, but potentially by thousands more. Behind them, Buddy let out a soft whine, pressing closer to James's chest. The sound seemed to underscore the stakes of the moment, a reminder of the innocent already harmed, of what further harm might follow if cooler heads didn't prevail. "Walk away," Robert repeated, the words hanging in the air like a physical presence between them. His tone wasn't pleading or aggressive, it was matter-of-fact, as if he were simply stating the most logical course of action. "You don't get to tell me what to do," Scott growled, but there was a new undercurrent in his voice, the first hint of doubt creeping in beneath the bravado. His eyes darted briefly to the growing audience, noting how a delivery driver had stopped unloading his truck to watch, how a group of college students had formed a small cluster near the shopping cart return, phones raised. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." Scott's internal struggle played across his face in rapid succession, anger, uncertainty, calculation, and wounded pride, all competing for dominance. His hands clenched and unclenched at his sides, knuckles whitening with each contraction. The leather of his jacket creaked as his shoulders tensed, his body instinctively preparing for confrontation even as his mind weighed the consequences. Robert's expression remained unchanged, his breathing steady. "I know exactly who I'm dealing with," he replied quietly. "The question is whether you do." A murmur rippled through the onlookers. An older woman whispered something to her husband, who nodded grimly. A security guard had appeared at the edge of the parking lot, speaking into his radio while keeping his distance, assessing the situation before intervening. Scott took half a step forward, testing the waters. "You think you're tough?" he challenged, voice rising. "You think because you've got an audience you're untouchable?" Robert didn't respond to the provocation. Instead, he shifted his weight slightly, angling his body to maintain clear sight of both Scott and James with Buddy. The movement was subtle but deliberate, not aggressive, but prepared. "This isn't about who's tougher," Robert finally said. "This is about choices. Right now, you can choose to walk away. No one follows you. No one bothers you. You get on your bike and ride off." Or he paused, letting the alternative hang unspoken in the air. Behind them, Buddy suddenly let out a small, defiant bark. The sound was startling in the tense silence, not fearful but protective, as if the little dog was finding its courage despite its injury. Several onlookers exchanged glances, surprised by the tiny creature's spirit. Scott exhaled sharply, running a hand roughly through his hair. The gesture was frustrated, cornered. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Wasting my time with this garbage." Something shifted in Scott's expression at the sound, a flicker of something that might have been shame, quickly buried beneath renewed anger. But the damage was done. In that moment, the contrast was undeniable. A small, injured dog showing more courage than the man who had hurt it. Robert remained silent, waiting. The parking lot seemed to hold its collective breath. With a final glare that attempted to salvage some semblance of dominance, Scott took a step backward, then another. His movements were stiff, his posture radiating resentment, but he was retreating. No one responded, no one needed to. The battle had been decided not with fists or shouts, but with the quiet dignity of standing ground against cruelty. As Scott continued his backward trajectory toward his motorcycle, the tension in the air began to dissolve, replaced by something else. A collective recognition of what had just been witnessed, of a small victory for decency in an often indifferent world. "You people are pathetic," he spat, addressing the crowd now rather than Robert specifically, "getting worked up over some stray mutt and a bum. Real productive use of your time. This is a joke," he muttered, voice pitched deliberately loud enough to carry. "All of you standing around like you're witnessing something important." He gestured dismissively toward James and Buddy. "It's a damn dog, a stray, not worth anyone's time." Scott's retreat was a masterclass in wounded pride. Each backward step seemed calculated to preserve whatever dignity he could salvage, his body language broadcasting defiance even as he conceded defeat. His jaw remained clenched, shoulders squared, eyes darting between Robert and the growing crowd of onlookers, as if memorizing faces for some imagined future reckoning. The parking lot had fallen into a strange, collective silence. The normal sounds, car doors closing, shopping carts rattling, distant traffic, seemed muted, as if the world itself was holding its breath to witness this small drama play out. A teenage boy who had been filming lowered his phone slightly, then raised it again, unwilling to miss the conclusion. A woman who had been frozen beside her car with groceries half loaded, finally resumed her task, but her movements were slow, her attention still fixed on the scene. Buddy, still cradled protectively in James's arms, had stopped trembling. The small dog's eyes remained fixed on Scott, tracking his retreat with an alertness that seemed almost human in its understanding. Then, in a moment that caused several witnesses to exchange glances, Buddy barked again, a short, sharp sound that carried no fear, only a final statement of defiance. Scott's step faltered at the sound. Something flickered across his face, a complex emotion somewhere between embarrassment and rage. Being challenged by a man like Robert was one thing. Being seemingly mocked by the very creature he had victimized minutes earlier was something else entirely. Robert remained perfectly still, his presence a human barrier between Scott and his previous targets. He didn't advance, didn't threaten, didn't gloat. He simply maintained his position, a silent guardian, allowing the situation to resolve itself without further escalation. No one responded to his demand. Instead, a subtle shift rippled through the gathered witnesses. A collective turning away, attention redirecting toward James and Buddy, concern replacing the tense anticipation of conflict. It was perhaps the most damning response possible. Not confrontation, but irrelevance. "Shut that thing up," Scott snapped. But the command lacked conviction. He had reached his motorcycle now, his retreat complete but his ego still scrambling for some final word that might reframe his withdrawal as a choice rather than a concession. Scott yanked his helmet from the motorcycle's handlebar, movements jerky with suppressed anger. "You people are pathetic," he announced to no one in particular, as he swung his leg over the seat. "Getting all worked up over nothing. Real heroes, all of you." The immediate danger had passed, but the story wasn't over. As the collective attention shifted from Scott's departure to the man and dog still sitting on the ground, the parking lot seemed to hold a question in the air. What happens now? The engine roared to life with unnecessary force, the sound echoing off the concrete walls of the supermarket. Scott revved it repeatedly, a final, futile display of power before pulling away with a deliberate squeal of tires. He cut sharply through the parking lot, forcing a woman with a shopping cart to step quickly aside, then disappeared onto the main road, the aggressive growl of his motorcycle fading into the distance. In his wake, he left something unexpected. Not fear or tension, but a strange sense of community among those who had witnessed the confrontation. Strangers exchanged glances, small nods, faint smiles of shared relief. The teenage girl whispered to her friend, "That was intense," while an elderly man shook his head and commented to no one in particular, "Some people just need to find better hobbies." With unhurried movements that somehow conveyed both strength and gentleness, Robert approached the pair. He crouched down to their level, his imposing frame folding with surprising grace, until his eyes were level with James's. The contrast between the two men was striking, one weathered by years of exposure and hardship, the other radiating quiet capability, yet in that moment, there was no distance between them, only shared humanity. "Are you both okay?" Robert asked, his voice softer now, the steel that had faced down Scott replaced by genuine concern. As Scott's motorcycle disappeared around the corner, the artificial tension he had brought with him dissipated from the parking lot. The gathered onlookers released a collective breath, the atmosphere shifting from confrontation to concern. Robert remained still for a moment, ensuring the threat had truly departed before turning his attention to James and Buddy. James nodded hesitantly, his weathered hands still protectively cradling Buddy. The small dog's breathing had steadied, though he remained pressed against his owner's chest. "I think so," James replied, his voice rough with emotion. "Thank you. Most people just," he trailed off, not needing to complete the thought. Around them, the parking lot had begun to return to its normal rhythm, though with a notable difference. Rather than averting their eyes as they typically might when passing a homeless person, several shoppers lingered, their expressions concerned. A young woman approached cautiously, carrying a bottle of water. Robert nodded, understanding the unspoken truth. Most people just looked away. "I thought you might need this," she offered, extending the bottle toward James. Her voice was tentative, but kind. James accepted it with visible surprise. "Thank you, miss." Robert watched the interaction with quiet approval before reaching into his jacket pocket. He withdrew a small leather case, and from it produced a business card which he handed to James. "There's a clinic about 10 blocks from here," he explained. "They don't ask questions, and they help people and their pets regardless of housing status." He gestured toward Buddy. "They should take a look at him. Make sure nothing's broken." James stared at the card as if it were some rare artifact, turning it over in his fingers. "I can't afford—" "You don't need to," Robert interrupted gently. "Tell them Robert sent you. They'll understand." A middle-aged woman who had been watching from beside her SUV stepped forward, her initial hesitation giving way to resolve. "I can drive you there," she offered. "It's getting dark, and 10 blocks is a long way, especially with an injured dog." James looked up at her, then at Robert, bewilderment clear in his expression. After years of invisibility, this sudden attention and assistance seemed almost incomprehensible. "Why would you do that?" he asked, a question directed at both of them, at everyone who now showed concern after Scott's departure. The woman shifted uncomfortably, perhaps recognizing her own previous inaction. "Because it's the right thing to do," she said simply. Robert stood, his tall frame straightening as he surveyed the small gathering. "Sometimes people need a reminder of that," he observed quietly. Buddy stirred in James's arms, his small head lifting to look directly at Robert. The dog's tail gave a tentative wag, a small gesture of trust that seemed to affect Robert more deeply than Scott's threats ever could. A faint smile softened his serious expression. Robert extended a hand, helping James carefully to his feet. The older man winced slightly as he stood, his joints stiff from sitting on the cold pavement, but he managed to keep Buddy secure in his arms. The small group began moving toward the woman's SUV, a spontaneous procession of newfound allies. "Will you go with her?" Robert asked James. "Get him checked out?" James looked down at Buddy, then at the woman waiting expectantly, and finally at the card still in his hand. After a moment's consideration, he nodded. "Yes, I think we will." Robert regarded him thoughtfully. "Sometimes that's all it takes," he replied. "Just standing there when it would be easier to walk away." As they walked, a teenage boy, who had recorded the entire confrontation, approached Robert. "That was awesome, man," he said, eyes wide with admiration. "You didn't even have to do anything. You just stood there and that guy backed down." The parking lot had nearly returned to its ordinary rhythm. As Robert watched James carefully settle into the passenger seat of Sarah's SUV, Buddy still cradled protectively in his arms. The small dog looked remarkably alert now, his initial shock giving way to cautious curiosity as he surveyed his new surroundings. Sarah closed the door gently before turning to Robert. Robert nodded. "Ask for Dr. Martinez. She's there until 8 most evenings." Sarah's expression held a mixture of determination and something like atonement. "I drive past them almost every day," she admitted quietly. "I've never stopped before." "The clinic on Westfield Avenue, right?" she confirmed, keys jingling in her hand. "You're stopping now," Robert replied simply. "That's what matters." As Sarah walked around to the driver's side, a middle-aged man approached, holding out a $20 bill. "For food," he explained, gesturing toward James. "Or whatever they need." His eyes couldn't quite meet Robert's, perhaps acknowledging his own earlier hesitation to intervene. Robert accepted the money with a nod. "I'll make sure he gets it." More people were approaching now, a grocery clerk with a sandwich from the deli counter, a teenager offering an unopened bottle of juice, an elderly woman with a small bag of dog treats, each contribution modest, yet collectively transforming into something profound, a community awakening to its better nature.